Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. Something new for us today, and that is a topic we have not discussed yet, and that is school boards. And I am so happy today to have a very expert guest to talk about school boards, and that's AJ Crabill. AJ serves as the National Director of Governance at the Council of Great City Schools. He recently served as the Conservator at DeSoto, Texas Independent School District, as Deputy Commissioner at the Texas Education Agency, and as Board Chair of the Kansas City, Missouri Public Schools. The third edition of his best-selling book, Great on Their Behalf, Why School Boards Fail, How You Can Be Effective, was released last month. I am not embarrassed to say I learned a lot from AJ and was very surprised about what I thought I knew was absolutely wrong. I think you're going to like this one. Good morning, AJ. Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works.
Gene, thanks for having me on the show.
Well, I was very excited to have a chance to talk to you about school boards. It's an issue that we haven't brought up before, but it's an issue that every school that we work with, has to worry about. So it makes sense that we understand that more. I think especially the people who get so frustrated about what's going on with schools. If we have a better understanding about a governing board, then I think we'll be a little bit more understanding of what's going on, or more critical. It goes both ways. So you have lots of experience, not only being on boards, but working with the school boards. Now, you're part of the Greater Council of Schools?
Yeah. It's
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, organization of the largest urban school systems in the country that came together about 70 years ago and said, we have a lot in common and we should support each other. And that's in all aspects of public school systems, from transportation and food service to instruction and, in my case, governance.
Now, when you work with the largest school districts in the United States, what are the common issues? Because you talked about from the beginning, you talked about transportation, we're talking about feeding kids, we're talking about all of these things. And then at the end of your sentence, you said, and governance.
So most of what's going on in public education looks pretty similar. Food service looks pretty similar wherever you go. The big difference with the large urbans is the scale. It's just different if you're feeding 1,000 kids once a day versus if you're feeding 100,000 kids 3 times a day. It's just a scale issue. Same thing with transportation. It's different if you are trying to put together a busing system that covers 300 square miles versus a busing system that just covers 10 square miles. The differences of scale, where they're kind of geographic scale and rural and population scale and urban, are significant factors. But at its core, third graders are third graders, eighth graders are eighth graders. And they're going to have a variety of needs, and school systems just have to figure out, how do we create a system that is responsive to the needs of the students that we have, so that we can help them improve what they know and are able to do, so they can be ready for the next level of learning and to live a choice-filled life. And in that regard, that expectation and that charge exists across all 13,000 school systems in the country.
And that focus is really what your work is, what you're truly trying to get the boards to do, is to focus on that learning for those students about how you move them along. Is that different? Is that different from large school district to large school district?
Not even a little bit. Whether it's large, small, massive, tiny. I've worked with districts with 150 students. I've worked with districts with way over 150,000 students. And the core charge of the board doesn't change. Like I said, the scale changes. And so obviously there are details that change. but the core mission of the board is the exact same, to represent the vision and values of the community in such a way that student outcomes improve. And that doesn't change. I mean, the reason school systems exist is constant. School systems exist for one reason and one reason only. And that's to cause improvements in what children know and are able to do so they can live a choice-filled life. And that's true. That's the same thing the parents in your neighborhood want, the same thing the parents in my neighborhood want.
Well, I think, well, let's just go there. I think you're saying that the parents want that, but it looks very different to some parents, what's going to happen in some neighborhoods or in their particular school. So when we're talking about working with all of these schools, there's a main goal of I want my kids to learn, but what they learn and how they learn is expressed very differently.
Absolutely. But that's because the context is just different. I'm thinking one particular school system, it was really important in their community that children had access to learning about underwater welding. Meanwhile, I'm thinking about a very different school system where it's really important to them that children had access to education about animal husbandry. And I'm thinking of yet another school system where it's really important to them that kids had access to classes that would teach them how to code. Now, as you can probably surmise, these are in three very different parts of the country and are really responsive to kind of local industries and things of that nature. What doesn't change is that parents want their kids to have the knowledge and skills necessary to live a choice-filled life, that they can live a life of meaning, of their own intention, of their own choosing, their own agency, and take care of themselves, their loved ones, and their communities. Like that is the constant. But certainly the details of what that looks like from community to community is certainly going to vary.
So how does a school board member learn about that they want underwater welding or that they want, a classic education or that they want these things? Is it really, community members coming to the board and speaking, or is it the superintendent comes to the board with what they've learned? What's the flow of information?
Yeah. So first and foremost, it is important. The job of the board is to represent the vision and values of the community. It's not the superintendent's job. The superintendent is not the community's representative. The job of the superintendent is to implement the vision and values of the community as conveyed to them by the board. But it's the job of the board to represent the vision and values of the community. And so if the board's going to do that job, then they actually have to go out and do the listening. They can't allow, a consultant or a staff or a superintendent or anyone else to be a proxy for that. They actually have to go out and do the work themselves. And so it would not be sufficient to, hey, we had a meeting and here are the 5 people who showed up. So that's the voice of the community. That's absolutely unacceptable. The reality is that communities, pretty much no matter what size your school system are going to require board members to take extra effort to go out and engage in the quality and quantity of listening necessary to really grasp a more holistic view of what is our community's vision for what students should know and be able to do. So it's through an intentional campaign of listening that the board members would harvest that insight, ideally from a representative sample of their entire community, not just the people who show up at board meetings, not just the loudest voice, not just the most influential voice, but really as broad and representational of a cross-section of the community as possible. And then takes all of that and sits down and develops it into a set of priorities that they then hand to the superintendent. Now, the superintendent certainly plays a role as the key advisor to the board. But at the end of the day, it's the board's job to identify the priorities, what we refer to as goals and guardrails. It's the board's job to identify the priorities and then hand those priorities to the superintendent and say, hey, here's what our community wants. Your job is to come up with a plan of action to figure out how to make it happen.
One of the things that has happened as I've gotten older is that I've realized that I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. And
I keep having that realization.
And I think one of those ways that manifests is that when I vote for somebody to be my representative, I want them to do more than represent my views. I want them to be a little bit more informed about those views. I want them to maybe push back a little bit. Maybe we can have some back and forth. And I'm talking about this in a macro level, just not an individual conversation. But I'm hoping that the board has some insights that I don't have as an individual citizen. What does a board member need to know about education allow it. So what's their level of expertise with regard to education? What should be expected by somebody
Um,
who votes them in, who's
yeah,
being represented?
this is a really important point, Gene, is and this is the point I think a lot of America gets wrong. The job of the board is to represent the vision and the values of the community. That is the unique area the board has the expertise in. What is our community's vision for what children should know and be able to do? What are our non-negotiable values as a community? That is the unique expertise that the board brings to the organization. The board is not an education expert. The board is not a finance expert. The board is not a legal expert. The board is not a construction expert. The board is not a football expert. Hey, there are all these things that boards wind up having to vote on and weigh in on, certainly. But none of that is the expertise of the board. That's the reason the board isn't the one going out and creating all these recommendations. It's professional staff who are experts in these areas, who have expertise in these areas, who are making the recommendations. And the board's job is to evaluate the recommendations, try to figure out what amount of alignment is there between this recommendation and the vision and values of the community. And that's really the basis on which the board is making a decision, not on an expertise. Oh, well, I know how to educate second graders in science. Ergo, here is the decision to make. That's not the decision that the board is making. What the board is really, inquiring into is, okay, here's a recommendation from a superintendent. Does this honor the community's vision for what children should know and be able to do, or while honoring the community's non-negotiable values that can't be violated? And so, because that's the case, as long as school board members are willing to put in the work and have the judgment necessary to represent the vision and values of the community, then they're fully qualified to serve on the school board. There's this misconception that, oh, well, you have to have all of these credentials and all these other things to serve on the board. But that's deeply problematic, because the moment you say that, you're saying that there's a specific subsection of our parent body who are somehow disqualified from serving on the school board, that they lack the necessary qualifications or pedigree to be on the school board. I think that's deeply problematic. And so the moment you recognize that the case, you realize, okay, so if that's not the qualification, what is? The qualification is they're willing to put in the work and they have the judgment necessary to represent the vision and values of the community. And they rely on the professional expertise of staff to make recommendations, and then they compare those recommendations with their understanding of the community's vision and values.
I can imagine, well, in my community where I live, that people will run for a school board seat. And as a platform will include, well, I was teacher negotiating. I was on the teachers union. I understand the negotiating process. Or, they have other educational
Oh yeah, absolutely.
experiences. Is that a positive or negative? Because I grew up in a small town, and we had local business people on. And it was a very microeconomic view of business. And I don't know if it helped or hindered making the decisions based on what you're talking about, understanding the role of the board.
I mean, the way I think about this is if I drove a school bus for 20 years and I get on the school board, does that mean we no longer need a transportation director because I know about this stuff? So I'll just make the calls. I mean, does that sound logical to you? And the moment it doesn't, the moment you realize that sounds absurd, is the moment you realize, okay, then that's clearly not the job. So yeah, are there board members with individual expertise? Some board members may be an attorney. Some board members may have been an educator. Some board members may have been an accountant. But the moment you realize we're not going to get rid of our CFO just because one of the board members knows how to count to 10, like we're not going to do that. And so the moment you realize that's not the game plan, it starts to inform that, okay, so clearly that's not the job of the board, is to try to replace the CFO. It's not the job of the board to replace the transportation director, which means it's also not the job of the board to replace the teachers, to try to replace the judgment and capacity of the teachers with their own judgment and capacity, or the principals, or the superintendent, or the maintenance director, or the athletic director. But then instead, their job clearly has to be something else. The other thing that helps solidify this is if your child, Gina, if your child was sick, would you want them to go to you, or would you want them to go to a medical professional?
Yeah.
Why?
They have expertise.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Like
their job. That's their job.
when it comes to the
Yeah,
welfare of
yeah, yeah,
children,
yeah.
we want to connect the needs of children with the expertise of adults. When it comes to the welfare of children, we want people with expertise in an area making the call. In the same way that you wouldn't, I'm sure you probably love your family members, but if your kid's sick, you're not taking them to the family members. You're taking them to somebody who actually has
Right,
expertise in
right,
how do
right.
I help my kid get better. Well, it's the same thing is true in a school system. Is when we need food service managed effectively, we don't go to someone just because they're on the school board. We say, okay, who actually has the most expertise? And let's actually hire that person to make it their job. They'll be over food service. And so that's the moment we recognize that, we realize that none of those things are the function of the board. And so there may be board members who have some type of lived expertise. That's perfectly fine. But that's not actually why they got elected to the board. Like nobody's ever elected someone to the board because, oh, well, you drove a bus for 20 years, so we should elect you to the board because then we won't need a transportation director anymore. Like nobody's thinking that. And the way you know that nobody's thinking that is you ask yourself this question. If someone had all knowledge about education, they were the most amazing teacher in the state, they were the most effective educator ever, and they run for the school board. If you found out that they were a Nazi on the weekend or were in the KKK on the weekends, would you still vote for that person to be on the school board? And the moment you say no, which I'm assuming you'd say no, that points out that you're not actually selecting school board members for their educational expertise. You're selecting them for their values alignment, that you have a set of values in mind of what makes sense to you. And you want someone who's going to represent your values on the school board, who on your behalf will bring their values to bear. And so even if you had the best educator, the most talented, the most acclaimed educator in the world, if you found out that there was a radical values misalignment, you never vote for them, because we intrinsically understand that when we go to the ballot box, what we're really looking for is someone to represent our vision and values, not someone who has operational expertise. So is operational expertise sometimes a bonus for board members? Yes. But it's not to be conflated with the idea that the board is now an education expert just because 1 out of 7 board members has some educational expertise, or that the board is now a transportation expert just because 1 out of 7 board members has some transportation expertise. You realize in that moment they have that, and that can be valuable, but it is fundamentally not the reason they were selected by the community. They were selected because of their perceived alignment with the vision and values of the community. And that tells you that is their expertise. And so they need to focus on tasks that require that expertise. The expertise of implementing the vision and values of the community is a separate skill set entirely. And that's what you should really select a superintendent for, and then let them do the work of implementation.
A little bit about the work that you do. Again, I don't have any expertise at all with regards to school boards, except for the fact that I was always working for one. And
Yeah.
and it's clear when boards are getting along. It's clear when they seem to be functioning well, and they may not be functioning in the manner in which with the goals that
Yeah.
you're espousing, but at least they're functional. I have a feeling that so a lot of your business might be you get called in when they're not functioning well. And, how do we get these guys to
Yeah.
work together? What does that look like? What are some common issues? What are some things that you need to work on with school boards?
Yeah. When we think about workability, for school boards, there's really two domains you want to think about. There's professionalism. And so that really answers the question, can this group of people function such that they can conduct the business of the institution? So that's the question of professionalism. Can they conduct themselves in a manner that allows them to conduct the business of the institution? Like if you have a bunch of board members who just hate each other and they can't get along and they refuse to show up and they can never get a quorum, well, we would say that is a highly unprofessional board. And we don't mean that in a pejorative sense. We just mean that in that they clearly aren't conducting themselves in a manner that allows them to conduct the business of the institution. And so when we think about a board, functionality or dysfunctionality, there's really these two dimensions, and one of them is professionalism, and that's what most people think about. And that's the one that I'm least concerned about. Like 99.9% of board members out here generally have a well-developed sense of professional behavior. They can manage that part. That's not my top concern, because the other dimension of functionality or dysfunctionality is effectiveness, and where professionalism asks the question, can this body conduct itself in a way that allows business to be conducted. Effectiveness asks the question, can this body focus on improving student outcomes as its reason for existing? And so what happens, you have to have some way of looking at, is this board actually focused on children learning? Is it actually focused on children growing and what they know and are able to do? That's the effective range of the spectrum. And this is actually the much more dangerous area where many more boards fail. Many boards can be very professional. They conduct themselves and they conduct businesses. They use Robert's Rules of Order, whatever. They do all the professional things, but they never actually dial into focusing on, are children actually learning? Are children actually growing? Are they actually getting the promise of education that we owe them as a community? That is a core dysfunction of school boards, not the professionalism part. They can normally sort that out. Like, we all see the few times where that doesn't happen because those blow up in the media. But honestly, that is a drop in the bucket. The vast majority of boards can actually manage the professionalism part. Where they are failing children is on the effectiveness part, that they're not actually dialed in. And so you will watch hours and hours of board meetings, and no one will ever have a conversation around, is little AJ learning? Did little Gene actually leave here with more knowledge and skills that he arrived with? Instead, it's conversations about, what's the color of the football uniform, and let's talk about the cheerleader constitution, and let's talk about, did, my cousin get a job, and, did, my sister, get a contract? And we get so focused in on all of these other things, and the conversation never makes it back to, did our students actually learn? Did they actually grow in what they know and are able to do? That's the core dysfunction of boards. Not that they fail to be professional, though that happens at times. The core dysfunction of boards is that they fail to be effective. They fail to focus on improving student outcomes.
When you're working with school boards on outcomes, what is a baseline of knowledge that they need to have about instruction, about what happens in classrooms, curriculum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to be able to make those big decisions?
So I know it sounds radical, but I would say they don't, because that's, even if one or two or three of the board members have some insight in that, it would never be appropriate for the board as a whole to subjugate its collective judgment to the judgment of the two or three people on the board who have that as a background. So that can't be the driving factor of how the board's making decisions. Do we have the expertise or not? Because the moment that's true, that means if there's any topic that comes up where the board doesn't have expertise, that means they just shouldn't vote. Oh, well, we don't have a mechanic on the board, so that means we shouldn't vote on anything related to repairing buses. No, of course they're still going to vote on that. And so now the question is, okay, then if they're still going to vote on that, on what basis are they voting? And that's when it becomes clear it's not based on the expertise of that specific topic. It's based on some other expertise. Well, what is that? It's the expertise and the vision and values of the community. And so every time something comes before the board for their consideration, what the board has to do collectively is figure out, what is the alignment between what is being asked here with the community's vision for what students should know and be able to do, and the community's non-negotiable values that have to be honored. That's the judgment call that the board is making. Not, do I like or dislike this strategy? Do I agree or disagree? Do I think this is the right strategy or the wrong strategy? Is that the strategy that I would pick? That's actually not the judgment call the board's making. The judgment call the board's actually making is this in alignment with the community's vision and values? And because that is otherwise amorphous, the first step that a board has to take is to actually have to write the vision and values down and make them plain. And that's what we refer to as goals and guardrails, where the board is just very explicitly articulated SMART goals about what students should know and be able to do. So then they have a real solid North Star for evaluating everything you bring before us, superintendent. Show us how it aligns with accomplishing this SMART goal about what students should know and be able to do. That's the judgment call that boards are really called to make. Now, I get it, people are twisted, because I made the same mistake. In a previous career, I was a computer programmer. And so, trust and believe, Gene, I got on the school board, and all of a sudden I was examining every piece of technology in the district. Hey, how come, this computer monitor is 500 years old, and, this accounting software is 800 years old, and what are we going to do to get this together? And I spent all my time talking about the technology. I didn't spend any time asking, what evidence do we have that children are actually learning and growing? And more importantly, I didn't ask the really fundamental question, is the highest leverage thing that our children need right now better computer monitors and better accounting software? But I didn't ask those questions because my focus wasn't children. In the moment, Jane, that I was focused on the technology, who was my actual focus?
With students.
It definitely was not the
Yeah.
students.
It's
In the moment that I was
yeah.
focused on talking about technology,
Uh,
who was my actual focus?
you.
It was
You.
100% me. It
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
nothing to do with the children. It was
Yeah.
100% me. And this is the trap that so many board members fall into. It's like, oh, I have this expertise. I have this one thing that I can bring. So I'll just focus on that. But that's about you. And being on the school board can't be about you. It has to be about the children. It has to be about what do they need. And so if I was really being focused on children, I wouldn't be thinking about what is my expertise. Oh, I was a teacher, I was a lawyer, I was a finance person, I was a computer programmer. I'd be thinking about what are the actual needs of our students that are most holding them back from the knowledge and skills they need to be successful in living a choice-filled life. And then I'd try to get those ranked out from what are the five most important. And technology is going to be on that list, but it's probably going to be like number 50. It's definitely not going to be the top five. And so if I'm actually focusing on student outcomes, then I abandon the thing that I know, technology, which is number 50 on the list, and I devote myself to whatever items number one, two, and three are. That's what it means to be student outcomes focused, is that I betray my own expertise. I set aside my own ego, my self-aggrandizement. I put that on the back shelf. And instead of showing up and saying, here's what I know, here's my expertise, I devote myself to figuring out what is it our children actually need that's most going to set them up for success. And if it happened to be computer monitors, Gene, I don't know, maybe in your expertise, you found the community computer monitors was the critical aspect to get kids over the hump. That's just not been my experience. And so the moment you realize that the individual expertise the board members bring can't be the focus of the board, that the focus of the board has to be what is it that our children actually need? What's most holding them back? And you try to figure out a prioritized list of those. That's what all the community listening is about. That's why getting feedback and insights from the superintendent is so vital. And then you say, okay, these are the three most important things. Then this is what we're going to be focused on. And am I saying that computer monitors don't matter? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying they're not the top priority for the board. And so the board needs to focus on whatever the top priority is.
So when you work with a board, you go in. I'm wondering about the actual work that you do, because I can imagine, what you just described. You're talking about how a board has to function, what they're doing, but you're also talking about what the relationship should be with the superintendent.
Yeah.
And then I'm wondering how far down the org chart do you go in your training? Because then you've got the soup, who maybe he's the guy who needs the new monitors, and so how far down? Not how far down. What's the breadth of the training that you have to do? Who do you need to bring in to make the board effective?
Yeah, so definitely, this is a keen insight on your part because the board definitely can't be effective on its own. It's really hard for a board to perform without, the respectful and appropriate support from their superintendent and, in general, the staff of the school system. Partially because the board aren't obligated to be kind of technical experts in any particular area. So they do need support from folks who do have technical expertise in the various areas of school system operation. And so the board can't be really effective without its staff. But the converse is also true. It's really hard for a superintendent to outperform the board. Like if a superintendent has the capacity here, but the board's capacity is here, then your superintendent's pretty much hanging out here from day to day. And so there is this mutuality where the board has to level itself up, constantly looking, how do we grow? How do we improve? And the superintendent's ideally doing the exact same thing, constantly looking at how do I grow as a superintendent? How do I grow in my ability to implement the vision and values while the board is figuring out how to grow in its capacity to represent the vision and values? And so that there is this overlapping mutuality between the two. There is not an overlapping set of duties, however. There are board duties and there are superintendent duties, and these don't actually overlap. The board makes decisions about what is within its sphere of control, and it controls those things. It focuses on those things. And then anything that the board doesn't retain for itself, then it's delegating to the superintendent, say, all these other things, you have to go, this is what we hired you to go manage. And so that is there isn't a overlapping Venn diagram of board duties and superintendent duties. There's the board defining what is our work that we're going to do. And then anything that the board doesn't claim for itself as board work, it's explicitly delegating to the superintendent as superintendent work. And that's how the delegation of duties winds up shaking out. And it's not actually all that complicated once you have a core idea that the thing that needs to drive the delegation of duties is expertise. Once you can wrap your head around the idea that if my kid is not well, I want someone with expertise in that. Not that I love my kid, but me loving my kid isn't the qualifying factor for who will take care of my kid when they are ill. It's who has expertise and will love on my kid. Love is necessary, but just insufficient. And so, in the same way that would be true in my home, it's the same is true in the school system. The board, its way of loving children is to create the conditions where people with expertise in the various things that children need are brought to bear and given the freedom necessary to actually implement the vision and values of the community while the board describes and dictates what the vision and values are. But that is a general high level overview of what the separation of duties are, but that it's derived from the board. And then the superintendent takes whatever is handed to them from the board and says, okay, then I've got the rest of this. I will put together a team to go execute.
One of the main, you didn't say this, but it's said all the time that one of the main decisions that the board has to make is the hiring of the superintendent.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have, I don't know what it is now. It used to be, superintendents, the average tenure was like 18 months or
15 minutes.
Yeah. So what does that have to say about the board? Or what does that have to say about how search firms bring candidates to a board? And have you ever been involved in searching for a soup or just finding a soup? That's kind of what I'm interested in hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, superintendent search is a major important topic. It's not the most important decision a board will make, but it's probably number 2 or number 3. For me, clearly the single most important decision the board will ever make is what is the focus of the school system? What are the goals this school system is going to pursue? What are the non-negotiable things that students must know and be able to do in the school system that have to be the priority for resource allocation? And so establishing the priorities, saying here's what the goals are, here's what the guardrails are, clearly the most important tasks of the board. And then monitoring progress toward those is really the next, every single month, having the superintendent bring evidence of are we making progress relative to the goals and guardrails are really the most important things the board does. But then, after that on the list, certainly hiring a superintendent is vital. But the board has to set the priorities first and then hire a superintendent who can show some evidence that they've actually helped move the needle relative to the priorities. Where most boards fail is they hire a superintendent to say, tell us what our community's priorities should be. This is a failure of governance. This is a complete abdication of the duties that are uniquely handed to school boards. The superintendent is not the community's representative, and so they shouldn't be thrust in that role because they lack expertise. The board has expertise in representation. The superintendent does not. And so the most important task that the board has is just declaring here's what the priorities are and then monitoring progress toward those priorities every single month without fail. But then next down that list, is certainly hiring a superintendent. When it comes to hiring a superintendent, then the board should say, here are the priorities. Show me some evidence that you've actually accomplished these. And if you can't show me evidence, then that's fine, but you can't be considered. And so it really requires the board to be really thoughtful about what would provide evidence that a candidate has actually moved the needle in the areas of our goals before. I mean, it completely changes the way that you would go about seeking out a superintendent, because honestly, most candidates aren't going to be able to show meaningful evidence because this work is really hard. And so most people haven't been successful at it. And so you're really looking for the needle in the haystack of who are people who have been successful. And they may not look like the person you look like. It may not be the person you know, or the person you're familiar with, or the person in the shiny, talks a good game. It may be this quiet person over here who's just put points on the board for kids year after year. That would probably be a better selection for superintendent, than the loud talking, bravado, person who gets everybody fired up. But when you actually look under the hood, has never actually been in a role that helped them move the needle on improving student outcomes.
So in hiring of superintendents, would that be something where a client might reach out to you at that point in time, something that they wanted some additional support on?
And we certainly provide we do not run superintendent searches at all. We definitely don't do that. Never have, never will. But we definitely do coach our boards that we're supporting, that we're coaching through the process. And, we have a full document that we give them, that describes here are all the types of decisions. We really want school boards to be in the driver's seat of superintendent search process. A lot of search firms, in my opinion, will put boards in the passenger seat. It's like, oh, well, we'll go out and we'll do all the listening for your community. I said, no, the board represents the vision, values of the community. The board should do the listening. But most search firms will say, oh, we'll go out and do it for you. And board will be like, hey, well, let's work for us. That sounds great. This doesn't sound great. It's a horrible abdication of the duties of the board to go out and conduct the listening itself. You should not put anybody, not a coach, not a consultant, not the staff, not anyone between the board and its community when it comes to listening for the vision and values of the community. So that's just one example of where I think the classical relationship between boards and search firms, I think, is just completely backwards. It's putting the search firm in the driver's seat and the board in the passenger seat, and that should absolutely be reversed. And so that's the type of coaching that we give boards. Is you are the community's representatives. You should be driving this process with some support from a search firm. If you want to use a search, you don't have to use a search firm, but if you're going to use one, just make sure they're in a supporting role and not in a driving role.
You've worked with, you work with large school districts, small school districts. I know I live in a county. I think there might be 35 school boards in this county with many single school districts. I mean,
Yeah.
because nobody wants to be told what to do.
Yeah.
So is there, though, in your experience, like a real aha moment when people realize, like, wow, this isn't at all what I thought it was going to be?
Oh, I think pretty much every school board member, if they're going to be honest with themselves, or at least honest with you, will admit that there is some point after getting onto the school board where they realized, I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, I campaigned convincing everybody, vote for me. I know what it's going to take to save the children. And then I get on the school board. I don't know what I'm doing. Gene, like, I love the children. And I didn't go out and deceive people. It's not like I was like, yeah, I will convince them. No, I really thought I knew something. It was only after I got on the board and served for a while that I realized I actually don't know anything about this role. None whatsoever. Not even a little bit. What I knew about governing effectively the day I got elected wouldn't have filled a thimble. But honestly, I think that's true for most of us. As school board members, we're just people who love children, want to make a difference, are willing to step up, and in most places volunteer like I was. In most places, school board members aren't paid. We're volunteers. And we just want to make a difference for the kids in our community and don't really have a deep insight into what are the nuances of effective school board governance. For example, most board members, when we get elected to the board or appointed to the board, can't distinguish between professional and unprofessional behavior as distinct from effective and ineffective behavior. They think, oh, well, if we are all just cordial, which is on the professional spectrum, that's synonymous with being effective. In reality, it is not. Just because you all get along doesn't at all mean that you're focused on our children learning. We can be very cordial, very professional, and highly ineffective at the same time. In fact, I'd say most boards would be described as professionally ineffective, that they are very professional in their behavior, that we conduct ourselves in a way that allows business to be done, but without ever actually focusing our attention as a governing body on our children learning. And so we're professional and ineffective. And so that's the challenge I think most board members, myself included, certainly fall into, is that the discernment about what it really takes to be focused on student outcomes eludes a lot of us. And so part of my work and the work of my team and my book and all these other resources, we try to make a lot of it freely available on the website, is geared around just trying to get the word out to as many board members as possible. Hey, here's what the actual job is. It's probably not what you think it was. It's definitely not what the people at the grocery store who, pull you aside, Saturday morning, try, hey, can you get my kid a part on the play? It's not the function of the school board. Hey, can you get my kid, the basketball coach isn't playing my kid. What can you do? I voted for you. What are you going to do about that? Oh, well, this isn't actually the job of the school board. And so what we often think the job is what it is in reality, something radically different. Again, I'm as guilty as anyone of that being true for me. Like, if I'm being completely honest, like, children were harmed by my first 2 years on the school board, that I was so ignorant about kind of what is it that boards can do to make a difference for kids, that boards can do to make a difference. I knew what a parent can do. I knew what a community member can do. I knew what a volunteer could do, but I was ignorant about what can a board do that's going to make the most difference for kids. And in my ignorance, And, it really wasn't until that third, fourth year that I really started to gain a powerful insight into kind of what does effective school board governance look like, not just professional school board governance, but actually effective governance is focused on student outcomes. It really wasn't until my third year on the board that I started to really gain an insight into that. And what it means is that there are kids who were harmed in my first 2 years on the school board because of my failure to be able to discern what it is that a board can do that is most effective, that's most focused on student outcomes.
I think that I keep saying that, what we have when I look at education and the discussion about education, that we seem to have several cults, silos, whatever we want to call them. But
Yeah,
I think they're more because, educators are looking for a place. We have a
mm-hmm.
difficult job and they're looking for a
Yeah,
place to belong.
a sense
And
of
so,
belonging. Yeah,
it's about tech, or it's about, inquiry learning, or it's
yeah,
about whatever it is. And so that's what I think, it's got to make the job of the school board member so hard, because those issues are complicated in themselves for professional educators thinking about it all the time, but they get moved into, so we've got, a political, it becomes political mixed with what's good for the students. How are
yeah.
we going to educate these things?
Well, and this is where it starts to be revealed that a lot of people think that like the power of the school board is in setting policy. And we hear that a lot. And I used to hold that as a belief as well. Now I consider that to be mildly naive, is that what the board puts on paper does matter. And policy is just essentially the written form of the community's vision and values. And so what the board adopts as policy does matter. I'm not suggesting it doesn't. I'm just saying it's not the most powerful way that the board impacts the institution. Because if what the board says doesn't match what the board does, guess which one staff is going to follow?
Yeah.
And so this is the challenge. If what the board does, its behavior, and when we think of culture, we think of it as a set of behaviors of all the people in the system. What the board does is going to be more powerful than what the board says in the minds of staff. And so if there is a variation between, if there is any wiggle room between what the board is saying and what the board is doing, then people are going to follow what the board is saying, what the board is doing rather than what they wrote down in policy. People will forget about the policy and they'll follow the behavior of the board. They'll follow what the board is actually doing. And you've probably noticed this with your own kids. It's like, hey, I said do this, but then I went and behaved this way. And then lo and behold, guess which one of those your child follows? And so what you say is only powerful if it matches what you're doing. And when the two of those match, like this is heady stuff. But when there is a gap between them, when there's a gap between board behavior and board policy, people are going to follow board behavior, not board policy. And so what it means is the board behavior is a powerful lever that most boards miss out on. So for example, take what you're describing. There are all these other shiny things of the day that people can get enamored with. Well, when the board spends its time, says, and policy, this is, student learning is the most important thing, but then spends its time in reality in board meetings talking about all the shiny things. Well, then don't be surprised when the staff focuses its time on shiny things as well, because they're being incentivized to do so by the board's behavior. But have a board that says, here are the most important things that students don't want to be able to do, and let's write those down as goals. Okay, that's policy. And the board matches that saying with doing every single month, monitoring progress toward those goals. Every single month, we want to see evidence of is little AJ's ability to do X, Y, and Z growing or not? Is little Gene's ability to do X, Y, Z growing or not? When the board says that student learning is important, and then what it does demonstrates that student learning is important, you actually begin to create a cultural phenomenon in that school system where people are no longer incentivized to chase the latest silver bullet, which is the behavior that most boards tend to inspire, but instead they're incentivized to chase whatever is actually going to move the needle for little AJ and little Gene. Because the only thing the board's going to look at is not the silver bullet, not the shiny thing. The board's going to forsake that entirely and dial in on, show me evidence, are these children growing or not? Show me evidence that they're learning or not. And where they're growing well, what worked and how do we do more? Where they didn't grow well, okay, great. What didn't work and how do we pivot? When the board gets that dialed in, its actions and its words match, that's when boards are most powerful.
It's just another thing in education that is simple but not easy.
No doubt. No doubt.
You haven't changed, in the 45 minutes that we've spoken. I mean, it is clear what they need to do, and then the devil's in the details. And what are you going to do? What are you not going to do?
Yeah.
So very interesting. AJ, I could talk to you all day. Do you have any questions for me, AJ?
I am curious. So now that I'm articulating this idea of boards represent the vision and values of the community, and that when boards are really powerful, they're at the epigee of their power when their words and deeds match. I'm wondering if you've experienced this. Now that you're getting a sense that might be kind of where the magic lives, have you seen a board that said this thing is important and that said student learning is important, and in their actions made it clear that's the thing they were going to be focused on in such a way that made it clear that's got to be everybody else's focus as well? Have you seen an example of that?
No, no, and I think the reason is, and I've spent a lot of time in small towns, working in small
Yeah.
districts, et cetera. I think we never got past what we brought up earlier of the individual board members bringing their particular expertise. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember one time I was a school board member. A school board was just absolutely in public, just demeaned, whatever the adjectives you want to use.
Yeah.
And it was because they didn't purchase tires from a local vendor,
Yeah, I hear
and
you.
that is, if you're in a smaller community, you're going to go get a cup of coffee and you're going to get an
You're
earful,
going to get an
and
earful.
and everybody's going to wonder, this is for our community. Who cares if say 5%, yada yada. And so I think we need to not only educate the board members, but the populace needs to know, hey, this
Yeah.
is the purpose of the board. And then the other thing that is, that I see that is really a hard to get to, I guess, was when you're talking about, is little AJ learning? Okay, there's a level of knowledge I think that board members have to be able to look at data, to be able to look at, what we're doing, to make those judgments. Because the other thing that happens in board meetings is everybody comes up and, let me show you our scholars, and, our, the fact that our scholars are, at 20% proficient doesn't matter. Look at them shine. And so there are these things that they need to get educated on without, and having an opinion and having a firm opinion about, no, this is not working, without not looking like you hate kids.
Yeah. Well, and it really is the obligation of the superintendent to present data to the board, one, that is explicitly relevant to the board's goals. That's why the board has to adopt SMART goals. So then it's not, what data are we bringing? No, we've already predefined the data. The data is the data. Now we're just wondering, is the data point here on the line graph, or is it here? Is it here? Is it here? Where on the line graph is it? It's really the superintendent, and we coach the superintendent on this. It's their job to present data in a way that is really be accessible to any parent, any community member. And so board members should not be expected to have a PhD in education leadership in order to discern are children going or not. It really needs to be presented simply enough that any community member could look at this and say, okay, it is clear to me that children are growing, or it's clear to me that children are stagnating, or it's clear to me that children are declining. But there should not have to be special expertise on the part of board members to be able to discern that. It is on the part of the superintendent and their team to present that in a way that is understandable and discernible. And if they don't, they have failed. And perhaps they just simply lack the expertise they portray themselves to have. A true expert can present information in a way that a layperson can understand the key elements of it without having to stop being a layperson. If someone can't do that, it's just that they're not truly an expert in the area that they've said that they've claimed to be an expert in. But this is one of the hallmarks of expertise, is they can make it clear to laymen without the person having to cease being a layman. And so that is on the superintendent, not on the board. I'm not opposed to the board gaining the insights that you're describing. I think that's valuable as well, but it shouldn't be a requirement. The requirement of digesting that and making it discernible falls to the superintendent as the board's selected education expert.
Great distinction, AJ. AJ, where could people find out more about you if they wanted to learn more about your work?
My website, you can look me up at effectiveschoolboards.com, and there's links to pretty much everything we've talked about here. There's free resources on the website. We just want people to have access to it. And if there's something that'll help you help kids, you don't even have to email me and ask, can we use this? The answer is yes. We just want the word to be out there. And so we try to make all the resources freely available to folks who have a heart for making a difference for our students.
AJ, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today.
No, I appreciate you having me. I look forward to coming back sometime to continue.
Absolutely. If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at gtavernetti, on Twitter, X at gtavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused, Adaptable, Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles.